Good morning. Today is May 3rd, 2024. It's my great pleasure to be here to interview Dr. Corale Brierley. Dr. Brierley is the principal at Brierley Consultancy, LLC, and senior advisor to the president of the U.S. National Academy of Engineering, of which she's a member. Dr. Brierley has a very interesting history that I think you will find to be very valuable to you as you explore it. I'm Mike Free, and I am a member of the faculty in the Department of Material Science and Engineering and also the chair of the department here at the University of Utah. This recording is part of AIME's Oral History Capture Program. We'll start off with the background from Dr. Brierley's early days. Maybe you can tell us, Dr. Brierley, a little bit about the place where you grew up.
Well, thank you very much, Mike, for that introduction. And I just want to say it's really an honor to participate in AIME's mission to honor the legacy and traditions of the organization. And I really appreciate being selected by the TMS to be part of the members' story. I grew up, I was born in Shelby, Montana. My folks were involved in sheep ranching on the Canadian border. But my first real recollection of life was when my parents moved to Kalispell, Montana. My father worked at a sawmill for a time. When I was about 5 years old, my parents moved to a ranch. They bought a ranch on the Boulder River in Montana. The ranch was about 50 miles directly north of Yellowstone National Park as the crow flies. And I was probably around 5 years old at the time, but growing up on that ranch was just really an idyllic situation. I rode horses, I had a bicycle, there was a mountain right behind the house, and I would play on that and trying to avoid the rattlesnakes. I did do some work on the ranch, actually. Besides swimming in the irrigation ditch, I also, during the summertime, would help my father rake hay. He taught me how to drive a tractor. He didn't allow me to use the mowing machine for very good reason, but he allowed me to use the rake on the tractor. I also was involved driving the tractor when my father would feed the cows, because this was a cattle ranch. He would feed the cows hay, and we had a hay wagon, and I would drive the tractor for the hay wagon. And I can distinctly remember one time driving on too steep of a slope, and the hay wagon tipped over with my father on it. That may have been, I think that probably was the last time I was able to drive the tractor for the hay wagon. I went to a one-room country schoolhouse, which had all 8 grades in one room and one teacher. It still amazes me to this day how one teacher can manage a classroom with 8 grades in it, although not every grade was represented every year, but teach the older kids and still nurture and take care of those that are the youngest. It was an interesting way of growing up and living a wonderful life.
That sounds very interesting. I've had a little bit of ranch work over the years, and I can relate to some of that. I didn't drive the wagon and tip it, but I've had some fun doing some haying. What influenced you in your life to go on to college?
Well, my parents had 6th grade educations. They were ranchers. And I had one older brother, but he never went to high school. So I really didn't know anything about college, to be honest. There was nothing in my life that at that point in time that would have taught me anything. But one of the responsibilities I had on the ranch was to help my mother clean the chicken house. And it was a job I absolutely hated. And I let my mother know that quite often. And she turned to me one day and she said, if you don't want to clean chicken coops for the rest of your life, then you need to get a college education. And her idea of a college education was for me to become a nurse, because that's the only thing she really knew about higher education. Um, After I graduated from the 8th grade, I went to a 4-year high school in Big Timber, Montana, which was about 25 miles or so north of the ranch. It was small. It only had 200 kids, and they were all from Sweetgrass County High School, or Sweetgrass County rather. In my junior year of high school, I was awarded a fellowship to attend Montana State University, which was in Bozeman, during that summer after my junior year. And I still remember my mother when I told her that I was going to spend my summer working in a microbiology laboratory at Montana State. She said, Corley, if the only thing they ask you to do is to scrub the floors, make sure that you clean the corners. And I still laugh about that because she meant it literally. uh, and figuratively, you can really take that to mean that that was really good advice, of which I've tried to live my whole life, which is, it really speaks to the importance of diligence and attention to all details of your life. Um, I had such a wonderful time that summer. So when I went back for my senior year of high school, I applied again for that same fellowship. It was from the Montana Cancer Society, and I was awarded it again, and went up to Bozeman again and spent that summer in the microbiology laboratory. Um, the next, I really never lived at home after that. I registered to go to college at Montana State University because I knew the landscape now, and I also chose to major in microbiology because that was what I knew at the time. I didn't really have any other interests, and I knew the professors and so forth. So it was a comfort thing, frankly. But my parents didn't have a lot of money, and so I needed to work. So I took a job in another microbiology laboratory that was working for Professor Temple, who was fairly well known in the literature for studying microorganisms that oxidize sulfur and iron. And one of the graduate students, the only graduate student, in fact, that was in that laboratory, he was working on his PhD, and his name was James Brierley. And so my job was to wash glassware, make reagents, various reagents. But Jim was studying the microorganisms from the hot springs of Yellowstone National Park. And his study area was an area called Geyser Springs, which is, if you're familiar with Yellowstone Park, it's near Artist Paint Pots, but it was a remote area. So there was no public, there was no trails, no public, and it was a great place to work because we had instruments set up and so forth. And my part of my job in the laboratory was to gather up the equipment that we would take to do sampling in Yellowstone National Park. And it was we would hike back in there and take samples and do our measurements and so forth. And then even in the wintertime, we would snowshoe in and we would camp. And it could be 30 below zero, but when you're camping on a hot spring area, it's nice and warm. It was really a wonderful and educational time.
Well, that sounds really fascinating. I think it's interesting, the motivation of the chicken coop and the opportunity to go to, have a program where for high school students to come in during the summer and get some laboratory experience. I think that's interesting. We see that a lot here in our work, that bringing people into the lab and getting them exposure really helps them to connect and sets a path in a lot of cases to these kind of fields. So that's very, very interesting. And I also think it's interesting that you could camp in Yellowstone in some remote places and get some bugs to cultivate and bring back and survive the winter in Yellowstone for a few days. So how did you do in college? How did that go for you?
Um, Not very well. At Montana State, I was, let's put it this way, I was just not a great student. I must have scored high on the entrance exams in math because what happened was when I registered as a freshman, they put me into engineering calculus, and it was taught by a graduate student. Um, and I did not do well in calculus. um, I got a D the first, the way they were on the semester system, I got a D the first semester. And the graduate student said, I'm going to give you a D. You can take the second semester. I took the second semester. I got another D. He said, I don't ever want to see you here again. So I'm going to give you a D so you get out of here. He wasn't terribly motivational. um, the the other D I got was in modern dance. I couldn't make like a rock. That was the problem, and I still distinctly remember that that was the requirement. You had to look like a rock or something. But anyway, I got a D. But Jim and I were actually started to date when I was a sophomore at Montana State, and we he proposed to me when I was a junior at Montana State University. He proposed me at Moose Flats on the Gallatin River. A wonderful memory. Um, so we, Jim was finishing up on his PhD at Montana State in the I guess it would have been, we got married in December of 1965, and he was finishing up on his PhD the early part of 1966. And so he was looking for a job, and his first job offer was at New Mexico Institute of Mining and Technology in Socorro, New Mexico. So we moved to Socorro in the summer of 1966, and I registered for college at New Mexico Institute of Mining and Technology. But I had to register as a junior because not all my uh, education was accepted down there. And also, those D's in calculus didn't help. So I had to take calculus again. But I had a wonderful professor. Fortunately, I did not have to take modern dance again. But the interesting thing about New Mexico Tech was I majored in biology because they didn't have a microbiology department. So I majored in biology. But there were only three professors, and my husband, of course, was one of them. So I ended up having to take classes from him at New Mexico Tech. And I didn't always get the highest grade. And Jim always wants to make it very clear that he did not marry a student when he was a professor. We were already married before we went there. But it was kind of an interesting arrangement because here I was a faculty wife, but I was also an undergraduate student. um, so um, I did extremely well in my studies at New Mexico Tech. I think for a couple of reasons. One is the professors were stellar, including the lady who taught calculus. The other thing is the classes were very small, so you got a great deal of individual help. The third reason was because I didn't want to embarrass my husband, who was now an assistant professor. So I think I was forced to have to really do well in college.
Yeah, well, that helps to have that extra motivation, right? There's a little bit of pressure. this could go bad if I don't do well, and be embarrassing and all that. But it's also, Corley, I think it brings up an important thing to our listeners too. I think that not everybody that you can be successful and have down cycle times where you're not doing as well in things, or you just don't have maybe the motivation to do extremely well. We just had our graduation ceremonies and things, and we talked about one of a very famous person in our community here at the University of Utah, started up a very famous company. I won't point out any names, but really struggled in school. And he had some teachers that told him, you're never going to be successful. You should just get out and go do something else. So, but it's interesting. I think it's persistence and then the motivation. Those are some important things, I think, for some of our viewers that look at this, that, no matter where you've been, you can go to some great places in terms of your future. So that's great. So then let's go a little bit into this career aspect. Who influenced you in guiding your career into the mining sector?
When I was an undergraduate at New Mexico Tech, every undergraduate student had to do a work study, and I was assigned to do my work study with Dr. Roshan Bapu, who many of the people that will see this video will probably know the name. Roshan was very renowned metallurgical engineer, and he had dual appointments at New Mexico Tech. He worked for the New Mexico Bureau of Mines and Mineral Resources, which was one of the divisions of New Mexico Tech, but he was also a professor on the faculty of the Department of Metallurgical Engineering. And Dr. Bapu was very interested in using microorganisms to extract metals. And so he and I really fit well together as a student. But one of the most important things he taught me was he really instilled in me an appreciation of the mining industry. And he taught me a lot of things about how the mining industry thinks. And that became extremely valuable to me as I moved forward. Following my graduation from New Mexico Tech with a bachelor's degree in biology, Jim and I left Socorro and we moved to Denver. And we both worked for Martin Marietta for 1 year. This really didn't work out for either one of us very well. And so Jim contacted New Mexico Tech again and said, would you take me back? And they did. So we moved back to Socorro, and part of the understanding of moving back to Socorro was that I would work on my master's degree. But there was no master's degree in biology at New Mexico Tech. So I did my master's degree in chemistry. And when Jim was finishing up with his PhD work in Yellowstone National Park, he had discovered this microorganism that defied all that was known for the limits of life at the time. It grew at 70 degrees Celsius. It grew at a pH of less than 2, and it oxidized iron and sulfur. But Professor Temple did not want Jim to get derailed on his PhD dissertation at the time by studying that microorganism. But Jim kept that microorganism. He carried it with him to New Mexico, and he kept it in culture at New Mexico Tech. So when I started my master's degree, I actually was working on the biochemistry. That was my master's work, was the biochemistry of that particular microorganism. And so that was essentially, I didn't do a whole lot of leaching work with the microorganism on my master's thesis, but it was more of a biochemical thing. So my I graduated then from New Mexico Tech with a master's degree in chemistry.
How did your career and education kind of evolve from there? You talk about the adventures back and forth a little bit with New Mexico Tech, and then maybe you can follow that up a little bit with how that evolved further with your education and your career.
Sure, Mike. Um, Here I was, Socorro, New Mexico. It has a population of about 5,000. Frankly, there's not a lot of opportunities uh, for work in Socorro. So I ended up taking a part-time job in the New Mexico Bureau of Mines and Mineral Resources running the electron microprobe. But I also started taking some graduate level classes at geochemistry and other classes that, kind of followed my interests. Um, it was interesting because when I took that graduate geochemistry class, the professor felt that if you were a graduate student, you were probably going to go into academia as a professor. And so he said, one of the things you need to learn how to do is write proposals to raise grant money. And so the course required that we write a grant proposal. And I got an A on my grant proposal. So I thought, why don't I just submit it to an agency and see what happens? So I submitted it to the US Bureau of Mines and it got funded. Here I was, I had no job, I had no laboratory, I had no office, but I had grant money. um, so I went to the director of the New Mexico Bureau of Mines, who was Dr. Frank Kotlowski at the time, and I said, I've got some money and I've got this grant. Do you suppose that you could give me a little laboratory space so I could do this research? And Frank was very amenable. So he gave me a small closet. I think it was actually the utility closet to set up my laboratory in. And I was still working at the microprobe lab as well. So I used that as my office. So I continued to submit proposals to the U.S. Bureau of Mines, to the Department of Energy, to the National Science Foundation, and I continued to raise a considerable amount of funding. But I would have to say that I'm very indebted to Tom Falke. Um, Tom, of course, is well known in the mining industry because Tom was the director of the U.S. Bureau of Mines at that time. And, to fund research, which these proposals involved were, that was very high risk research to be funding because the proposals involved using microorganisms and specifically to use that high temperature microorganism for extraction of metals. So I'm very indebted to him. But I continued to raise money and eventually I here I had a master's degree, but I hired a technician, full-time laboratory technician, and I also was advisor to a number of master's students at the time, and I was faculty as designated by the president. I was very interested in trying to work on a PhD, but I just found it very difficult because I had a lot of duties. I had a lot of travel that I was doing for my research as well as conferences and that sort of thing. So I found it very difficult to try to work on a PhD. But it was during this time that Jim, he was now probably an associate professor at this point in time. He had a sabbatical leave to go to the UK for 6 months. And I wanted to go with him, so I took a leave of absence to go with him. And I applied for a fellowship at the Royal School of Mines, Imperial College in the UK, and I was awarded that. So I spent 6 months at the Royal School of Mines in the UK. I took some classes while I was there, just, I didn't take them for credit. I just sat in on them. And um, the Royal School of Mines, they wanted me to stay on and do a PhD. But I was, fairly newly married, and I didn't feel that, that distance was what I really wanted to do. So we returned to Socorro again, and I continued to do some research. But there was continuing pressure on me to get a PhD, because here I was in a quasi-academic situation. I was on these committees for graduate students, so I finally started looking for a place to do a PhD that would give me a 1 year's um, would get me a one year residency basically, because I had a sabbatical leave coming, and so I finally found a university that would allow me to have a 1 year residency. It was the University of Texas at Dallas. So I had a fairly substantial research program. So I talked the US Bureau of Mines into letting me move part of my money down to the University of Texas at Dallas. So I paid for one half of my salary. The other half was being paid by my institution as a sabbatical leave. So I sponsored a master's degree student while I was there, and I also paid my advisors, my PhD advisor, summer salary. Um, and this was in return for allowing me to take the classes that I wanted to take, and to give me a private office because I was doing consulting work at the time as well. Um, so, um, and I still had my technician back in New Mexico, and she did my research for me for my PhD dissertation work. Um, so it was a different sort of a PhD, but nevertheless I did get it, and it was a PhD in environmental sciences.
Yeah. Well, if only our PhD students came with their own funding and funding for another master's student and had all of that going for them already, that'd be amazing. So that sounds like a really neat opportunity that you had, and that you could develop some of those like proposals into funded projects and have a lot of things going on while you were working as a technician and kind of deciding on what to do with education and then moving it forward into a PhD. That's fantastic. That's an amazing story that I'm sure a lot of people will really find interesting and motivating. So great. Well, let's talk a little bit about starting up your transition into starting up a company. I think that was interesting when we had talked previously. That's another area that I think people will be very interested in understanding that transition and some of the things you've learned from that.
Oh, this was interesting because it happened while I was writing up my PhD dissertation. And I was contacted by an individual who was serving on the board of directors of a venture capital fund. The venture capital fund was a publicly traded venture capital fund that was managed by Lord Rothschild. And as it turned out, Lord Rothschild from the UK, he was a banker type, was a very good friend with Harry Oppenheimer, who many of the people who will view this know that Harry Oppenheimer was chairman of Anglo American and also of De Beers. And he and Lord Rothschild very much wanted to have a company started that would use microorganisms to extract metals. And so I was approached to start that company. Um, this was so alien to me. And I also needed to finish my dissertation, writing my dissertation. But I took about a year in which I traveled around a little bit and started meeting with some venture capital people and tried to understand what this was going to entail. Ultimately, what I did was I founded a company by the name of Advanced Mineral Technologies. And my job was really to build the team, and to raise money. Although the Rothschilds put in quite a bit of money, they wanted me to raise money from other venture capital firms, which is pretty common to do. And they also linked me up with a venture capitalist who had started his own company, although it involved electronics, not in the bio area. But that venture capitalist's job was to mentor me. And he was pretty tough on me, I have to admit. But I remember, I had to write a business plan, and I gave it to him, and he said, slammed it down on the table, and he said, "This looks like a proposal to the NSF, not a business plan." And so he really taught me how to look at technology from a business standpoint. So my company, the other thing, I started the company in New Mexico, in Socorro, but the venture capital community felt that it was very important to move that company to someplace else. And they suggested Colorado, principally because these venture capitalists had condominiums in Vail. And I think they thought that, and they felt that if the company was located like in Golden, that would be a really ideal place. Then they could go to their condominium more often and go skiing. So we moved the company to, in 1985, we moved the company, or I guess it was a little before that. We moved the company to Golden, Colorado, and I had 25 scientists and engineers in the company. I also hired my husband as the research director of the company. We patented several technologies. One of them involved using the high temperature microorganism for the stirred tank biooxidation of refractory sulfidic gold ores. That is where the gold is locked in a pyrite mineral or an arsenopyrite mineral. The microorganisms would break down the pyrite or the arsenopyrite, release the gold, and then you could do a cyanidation of that gold and improve the recovery. This would be for a concentrate of the gold. We also patented some technology on using microbial products to concentrate metals from wastewaters that were emanating from mining operations or from battery manufacturing facilities or electroplating plants, that sort of thing. So it was a different lifestyle. It was a different thing for me, and a real experience.
Well, that's a big transition to make from, being an academic sort of in terms of having projects and proposals that you write and then working on the research in a lab versus making a company where you got to essentially make a profit doing what you're doing and getting it out into the real world and dealing with the business aspects and actually running a big operation, right? With a lot of different people, a lot of wheels turning quickly. And that sounds very adventurous and very interesting. Maybe you can talk about some of the challenges and they can relate back to the, running this company and just some of the challenges you had maybe in relation to that, but also just in your career in general.
Yeah. Well, uh, that company turned out to be one of the biggest challenges of my life. It was going well. I mean, we were doing well. We also had research grant from Newmont to look at using microorganisms to do heap leaching of refractory sulfidic gold ores. Um, Everything was going swimmingly, and then Black Monday. um, you have to be a certain age to appreciate that that was October 19 of 1987. And my company we were about to do a substantial investment deal with a large London-based chemical company. Um, And overnight, globally, the stock market crashed. And that company that we were going to do this deal with lost half their value overnight. So they canceled the deal that we were going to do. We couldn't raise any funding because the venture capital community was conserving their cash to support companies that were closer to going public. And we were not ready to go public. So I couldn't raise any money. We didn't have enough revenues to support the company. So I found myself having to lay everybody off, including my husband. And the other aspect is we owed a lot of money. The company owed a lot of money. We owed the patent law firm out of New York money. We had another law firm that we owed money to. We owed money to Federal Express. And so my job was really to sell assets of the company and to keep the company out of bankruptcy. So I had to hire another law firm because I couldn't use the law firm that we had because we owed him money. So I had to hire another law firm to manage the money from the sale of assets. And so Newmont actually bought a lot of the assets of the company. And the reason why is because they hired Jim to work in their laboratory to further the work that we had already been doing on that contract with Newmont. So Jim moved to Salt Lake City because that was where Newmont's laboratories were at the time, and I remained in Denver to deal with the sale of assets. The experience that I had was traumatic because I kept getting these telephone calls from the patent law firm. They said, we're not receiving any money from the sale of assets. And I would go to the lawyer and I'd say, well, aren't you paying the law firm? And he'd say, well, I sent a check. And this went on and on several times. And finally, this was a major law firm here in Denver. And so finally I called and asked to talk to the principals of the law firm. And one of the guys answered, and I told him, I said, something's going on. I want you to check what's going on. So he said, I'll call you back in 24 hours. Well, he didn't call me back. And so I thought, well, I'll wait another 24 hours. So I waited another 24 hours. And he called me back, but this time both of the principals of that law firm were on the call. And the first thing they said was, don't file a lawsuit against our law firm. Oh my God, what's going on? What had happened was that lawyer was embezzling the monies from the sale of assets. He had set up a checking account with a Boulder, Colorado bank. And so all this money was going to that checking account. But the good news is the law firm, they made it good. And I got kind of wrapped up in, because the law firm, of course, fired this lawyer, and then I had to deal with the Colorado Supreme Court because they were going to take him to task as well. So that whole thing was really quite a traumatic experience. So I then moved to Salt Lake, but I needed a respite from that. So we were building a new home in Salt Lake, and so this took some time to build that new home. And I also was editing a book with a colleague of mine, and so I worked on that. And then Newmont decided to hire me, and in a parallel position with Jim's position that he was in. And so they hired me as Chief of Environmental Process Development for Newmont. And at the time, Newmont was, they had some legacy issues in southern Colorado, one of the operations near Uray and Telluride. There was some environmental issues there. Um, and also they had the situation in Leadville along with the Sarco. So I was involved in both of those, the cleanups of those. And then, so I got a lot of experience working with the EPA and with other mining companies because we had to come to agreement with the other mining companies on the cleanup. Um, this was 1990s, early 1990s, and Sir Jimmy Goldsmith had acquired a controlling interest in Newmont. And one of the first things he wanted to do was clean house. And so the upshot for me was this, that me and quite a few others across Newmont's operations got laid off. And this was 18 months after I had joined Newmont. So here I was in Salt Lake. Salt Lake wasn't very large at that point in time. Mike, you probably recall it wasn't a very big city at that point in time. So there wasn't a lot of opportunities. So here I was, unemployed again. And so that was kind of the second challenge.
Well, and I think some of these challenges, lead to other opportunities. And I think it's interesting to see in your career how some of these challenges and have led to transitions that have been very interesting in terms of what they've led to.
Yeah, I started looking for jobs, and yeah, I was offered jobs. One of them was in California, at one of the national labs, and Rocky Flats here in Colorado was being cleaned up at the time as well from the nuclear waste from a plant that was there. They offered me a job as well. Neither one of those really appealed to me, and I was going to have a commuting marriage, and I really wasn't keen on doing that. But I continued to look for jobs, and one of the companies that they were looking for an environmental person. So this was Battle Mountain Gold, and so I applied for that job, but I just really didn't have the kind of credentials in the environmental arena that these mining companies were looking for. Um, but in communication with Battle Mountain Gold, they said, Coralie, we've got this project in Bolivia called Coricoyo, and we have this gold that's locked in pyrite, and we're looking for a process, and we're aware, of because I was pretty well published, so a lot of my research work was obviously well known. So they said, we don't want to hire you, but would you be willing to do consulting work for us? And by then, I'd also had been contacted by the Department of Energy. So I was doing consulting work for the Department of Energy on the nuclear waste site down in southern New Mexico. So I then taking on this particular job with Battle Mountain Gold as a consultant, and then shortly thereafter, after I started working on that project with Battle Mountain Gold, I was contacted by Tech Corporation because they had a project called Quebrada Blanca that was in the Andes. It was a low grade sulfidic copper. It was a secondary copper ore, chalcocite, cobalite deposit, and so they were already in operation, but things were not going particularly well, and so they wanted to know if I would advise them on that. So I didn't have any time to look for a job anymore. I had 3 consulting jobs, and so I thought, well, maybe I can make a living. Of course, Jim was the breadwinner, if you will. So it wasn't like, I was having to survive on my own. But I ended up with some very, very exciting projects. And it was serendipity because it turned out that there were a number of companies around the globe that had these kind of low grade secondary copper deposits that they were looking at trying to leach, but they didn't have a good handle on the bio aspects of it. And I remember when going up to Quebrada Blanca, which is at 14,000 plus feet in the Andes, and I looked at this huge heap leach operation, which of course then it was pretty small, but I wasn't familiar with looking at these huge heap leach operations. And they said, the manager turned to me and he said, "Make it work." and I thought, okay. You take things from a 6-foot column that I had been working with in the laboratory to working at something that was now 20 or 30 meters high. And they were dumping ore at a fairly fast rate at 30,000. Well, I don't remember what they were dumping or heap leaching at the time, but this was pretty intimidating for me, but it was really challenging and really fun. And as you know, Mike, the mining industry is pretty small. So word got around, um, and at this point in time, I started trying to figure out how to build a business out of consulting work. And you have to get out there and let yourself be known. How do you do that? You use your professional associations, of course. And so I started teaching short courses. Some of them were in Australia for the operations for their professional societies in Australia. But I also started co-teaching actually, a heap bleaching short course that was offered. Sometimes it was with TMS, and other times it was with SME. And so I co-taught with colleagues that were also in the consulting business. So we co-taught these things for years. I also would give papers, technical papers, and so this really was cheap advertising. To get your name out there and get your qualifications out before the industry. So pretty soon I was traveling, around the world. Most of my jobs were in South America, principally Peru and Chile. I did have that job, of course, in Bolivia and Australia. One time I went to Australia, I think 6 times in one year for jobs. Some of them were in South Africa. I did travel to South Africa quite a bit because I was working with one of the major mining companies down there. Um, Indonesia, China, uh, Myanmar. It was. I had found where I wanted to be. This was clearly what I was really cut out to do. I loved doing it. So it was I was truly in my element, um, doing that consulting work, and I really delighted working with and still do work with the professionals, not only at the mine sites, but you work with a whole cadre of professionals. The metallurgists, the mining engineers, the geologists, senior management. So it was an extraordinary experience. Of course, being a woman, um, I was probably, I'd go to these mine sites and they would say something to the effect that this is the first time they'd ever seen a woman that worked in this kind of an area before. So it was truly, truly exciting, and it still is. And oftentimes I'm asked by young women, isn't it really tough being a woman in these kinds of environments? um, are you treated well? Are you respected? And I would have to say that I was and I am better treated than many of my male colleagues that are involved as consultants as well. So there's really no issue being a woman in this particular area.
Yeah, well, that's helpful, Corley, to let the young women know that, and also the men. I mean, I think it's nice that you have had a good experience that way and not really found much of an issue in that sense, and in some ways maybe treated a little bit better. Because I think there's a lot of opportunities out there for young women as well in this industry, and a need to bring more people in. So I'm glad you're willing to say that and bring that out. Well, let's talk about some other things, Corley. And one of the things I was going to ask you is, are there some experiences that you've had that were particularly memorable?
Yes. Some of them are really good. Some of them are a little more challenging than others, but I think from a positive standpoint, um, I would have to say that one of the memorable experiences that's happening as we speak, and that is that um, I worked on this high temperature microorganism, and Jim co-authored a number of the papers. But this was, mind you, back in the 1970s and 1980s, early 1980s. Um, but this high temperature microorganism has never been used commercially. um, and here we are, 40 plus years out. And albeit a lot of my research back in those days involved using that microorganism for what we call refractory minerals, for the leaching of refractory minerals, such as chalcopyrite, molybdenite. The industry really, I mean, they have technology for processing those minerals. And so they really have had no interest or incentive to ever consider anything different. However, as we probably know in the mining industry, things are changing. The ore grades are getting lower. Um, the, the ore is becoming more difficult to process. And those two things combined means that the conventional technologies are too expensive to be used. So the industry now is looking at alternatives, particularly because chalcopyrite is one of the most prevalent of the copper minerals in the globe. And so now they're beginning to look at alternatives. And there's not a lot of alternatives that are terribly effective. And so lo and behold, this research, it's now 40 plus years old, is now being considered. And so there has been a pilot operation set up, and I've fortunately been involved as a consultant on some of these. So I think from that standpoint, this is memorable. I hope that I can see this actually get applied at full scale. But there's other challenges that have been kind of interesting. I think I mentioned earlier um, that working at Quebrada Blanca, um, working at 14,000 feet in the Andes is some people can't take it. I was very fortunate that that I was able to not get sick while I was there, and I spent quite a bit of time there. But it was an extraordinary experience. It was the first time in my life I ever could look down and see stars because you are so high that the night sky is actually in some cases below you. And of course, the sky is so clear. That's the reason they put telescopes in the Andes, is because it's so clear that you can see things. I've never seen the Milky Way so beautiful. So that was just spectacular. One of the more adventuresome consulting jobs I had was in Myanmar. Um, this was a Canadian mining company that had engaged me. They had a joint venture with the Burmese government for a copper. It was a secondary copper heap leach operation, and they needed some advice because it wasn't. They were concerned about a couple of things. So they told me to travel light because you fly U.S. to Bangkok, and also then from Bangkok to Yangon, which was the former Rangoon. And then you had to fly to Mandalay. um, and then there was a long four-wheel drive trip. And then you get into a boat and cross the Chinwin River. And then you get into another four-wheel drive and you travel to the mine site. So I had carried 2 pair of jeans, my steel-toed boots, and a pair of sneakers, and a couple of shirts. And while I was at the site, and this was a challenging site because at the time that I was there, it was a military junta that was controlling everything, so there was no communication with the outside world. In fact, there was not even communication between like the mine office and the metallurgy office, or the metallurgist and the geologist. You had to get into a pickup and drive there. The other aspect of that was, I had no communication with Jim, and I didn't know how long I was actually going to be there, and he didn't know exactly where I was. But nevertheless, it went well, and it was run by a bunch of Aussies, the mine side. So, the language was not an issue. But the Minister of Mines contacted the mine, and he said he wanted to meet with me at the government offices in Yangon. And the first thing I thought was, I don't have a thing to wear. It's a typical reaction from a woman, right? I don't have a thing to wear. And the Aussies said, oh, don't worry about it. We'll take you shopping. And so they took me. Of course, we had to cross the river to this little tiny village. But shopping in Myanmar, you go to a fabric shop, you buy the fabric, and then you go to a tailor and have your dress made. So, of course, then we went to a bar and waited for the dress to be made. And so then we finally retrieved the dress, and they bought me a pair of thongs, not that kind of thong, but the kind that you put on your feet, the flip-flop type. So I had some decent shoes to wear. So then we went back across the river, but the problem was that the boat that regularly takes people back and forth across the river wasn't operating because it was now night. So the Aussie guys that I was with bribed some young Burmese lads to take us through in a raft, and it was night, and there was one person in the front of the raft with a flashlight, and then there was a person in the back of the boat with the motor, and I finally figured out what that person was doing in the front with the flashlight, because at night they used that river to transport teak logs from the mountains down to the mills, and he was watching out for those logs, and those things were enormous. And I thought, I don't think this is where I want to end my life. But nevertheless, it all turned out good. So I made my way back to Yangon and met with the Minister of Mines, and of course he was dressed in the Burmese dress that these people wear in Burma and Myanmar, and he was so taken by the fact that I was dressed, because this dress was Burmese through and through, and he was so thrilled that all he wanted to do was take pictures. I don't think he asked me one thing about the mine site at all. So it was an incredibly fun trip. All in all, the other aspect of that trip was because the U.S. government, because it was a military junta, there was no U.S. offices. There was no embassy or anything. And in fact, when I went, I couldn't even get a visa to go to Burma, to Myanmar. That had to come from the Canadian government. So I had sent my passport to the mining company in Canada, and they had gotten my visa from Ottawa. So I thought, okay, I'm landing in Seattle and I have a visa from the Canadian government. I don't have a visa from the US to go to Burma. Of course, the first thing they asked me is, where have you been? That, when you come into the United States, it's the first thing, where have you been? And I thought, but the guy never questioned it at the entrance to the U.S. So I lucked out on that one. There was another adventure. My consulting work really involved more than just working for mining companies. Um, I was doing work for the investment community as well. I was consulting for the investment community, where they were doing due diligence for operations that were looking at using bioleaching technology, whether it was stirred tank bioleaching or heap leaching. And one of these jobs was with an investment company to do due diligence on a copper operation that was looking to operate um, in Indonesia. And this was the operation was on a very remote island called Wetar, which has a very, very limited population of natives. The only way to get there was using the supply boat that the mining company uses to transport supplies from one of the other islands. So I flew in and to this place where to catch the boat. And this was the first time I'd actually met the investors that I was going to be working with. And there were two of them, both men, of course. And so when we boarded the boat, they said, well, Corley, we're going to give you the VIP suite. Well, the VIP suite turns out to be in the bowels of this boat, next to the diesel engine, so you could smell all this diesel, and also adjacent to the galley, and so you could smell all this fried food. And there was two bunk beds, which I ended up sharing with my two male companions for 2 days and for 2 nights. Um, and the seas were rough. The smell of diesel, the smell of this food. I was sick for 2 days and 2 nights on this boat, which was named the Perseverance. And when we finally got to the mine site, of course, you have to get straightened out and do your job. But I thought to myself, this investment company is never going to ask me to ever work for them again, because they figured that Corley is this wimp and she gets sick all the time. So we're not going to, but they did. They were apparently happy with the job. And a couple of years later, they did have me do another consulting job. But um, the, the, it was, it was challenging. And I think the message here to young women is that the jobs are challenging, they're enormous fun, and there's going to be some times of discomfort. Whether it's spending a couple of nights with men that you don't know in bunk beds, or whether it's going to be places where you're not really feeling quite good because the conditions are a little treacherous for you. But in you forget about it. You only remember all the good things, and the fact that you're working with fabulous people, and you've got challenging work.
Well, yeah, and you also have some great stories to tell after those adventures, right? I mean, those are probably really fun stories to retell and reflect on. And I think it's kind of ironic the boat was named Perseverance, so that seems to be apropos to the situation, right? So, yeah, that's fun. So you've had a lot of adventures, you've had a lot of interesting times, and I think it's interesting that you've been very excited about the opportunity to really see things succeed, and to help these companies make these operations work. There's a lot of satisfaction that comes from the job, and so I think that's another point that has come out from this conversation with you in this interview, is that there is a lot of satisfaction in doing these kind of things, and it does take a little bit of an adventurous spirit going along with it, right? You have to take the kind of the risk of going places and doing things that are a little out of your comfort zone to get to the end of that satisfaction part that comes with actually working with these operations. So that's fun. Yeah,
Perseverance.
that's right.
Perseverance.
Right. And kind of adventure too. So yeah, that's fun. Thanks for sharing those stories. Maybe we can talk a little bit more about the professional society aspect. How have professional societies benefited your career?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, the, the opportunities that SME and TMS particularly offered me to teach short courses. I mean, I could not have had a consulting career without that opportunity. Um, and I've also gotten reasonably involved with um, giving papers, technical papers. I also do a lot of reviews for particularly the SME journals, um, and I still do those. Very heavily involved in that aspect of it. Um, the other ways that I've gotten involved in the societies are obviously networking. I mean, um, if the people that you meet, I would have to say that that's probably one of the most important things of a professional society, is to meet people. And clearly, the people that I've met over the decades, because I've been a member on and off of TMS for years, and I've been a member of SME for, I hate to say this, for 50 years. Celebrating my 50th 50th anniversary this year of being a member. I tell people that I was the youngest person that ever joined a society. I think I was 8 years old, but nobody believes that. um, but just that aspect of it. The other thing is that um, uh, I've been involved in chairing, probably not as much as I should have over the years, but I've chaired the awards committees uh, for SME particularly, and you meet again. I repeat, the most important thing is meeting people, and this this had a huge this the people that I met through SME and TMS had probably one of the most consequential aspects of my career, because I was elected to the National Academy of Engineering in 1999. And to become a member, you have to be nominated and referenced by people that are members of the National Academy of Engineering. And some of those people, I didn't know this, but some of those people that I was meeting and interacting with through SME and TMS were in fact the people that probably were the ones, well, I'm almost certain they were the ones that nominated and referenced me for election to the National Academy of Engineering. And so and for the viewers that may not necessarily know what the National Academy of Engineering is, um, it's it's one of the highest professional honors that can be accorded to an engineer, um, and and the job of a member is to advise the government on matters related to engineering and technology. Um, so I think that you cannot go wrong as a young person, whether you're male or female, um, is joining your professional society and getting engaged and out and get out there and network and meet people, because it's gonna have a huge impact on your career.
Yeah, I agree. I've been very happy with the interactions I've had in professional societies, and in particular, TMS and SME have been very good for me in terms of the professional network. And like you say, it's about people, it's about that networking. Where else are you going to get that? I mean, you get a little bit with just working, but when you bring these societies together for big meetings and things like that, there really is a big opportunity, and getting involved makes additional connections possible. So yeah, that's a great point. I'm glad you brought that out, and have been such a supporter of those. Maybe we can go a little bit further into that aspect of kind of the honors and awards you've received in your career that in some ways are connected to these societies, but maybe you can tell us a little bit about those.
Well, I've been particularly privileged to have received several honors and awards. I mentioned in 1999 I was elected to the National Academy of Engineering, and uh, my citation, by the way, was for innovations applying biotechnology to mine production and remediation. um, so um, that was probably one of the most privileged elections that I had. But I also want to tell a quick story about that. I had always considered myself a scientist. And all of a sudden, when you get elected to the National Academy of Engineering, you're an engineer. And as you well know, because I've been talking about none of my degrees are in engineering. And so I had a little bit of trouble understanding this, but it turns out that over 20% of the NAE members do not have engineering degrees. It's what you do and the accomplishments and the impact that you have on engineering and society that make you qualified for election. And so I still have a little bit of trouble when I talk with people discussing the fact that I'm an engineer. Anyway, I was also in 1999, I was the recipient of New Mexico Tech's Alumni Association Distinguished Achievement Award, which was a very, very nice award. And then in 2008, I received the AIME James Douglas Gold Medal Award, again for applications for pioneering research and contributions to applications in bioleaching and metals remediation. In 2011, I got the SME's Milton E. Wadsworth Award, again for pioneering contributions to bioextraction of metals and remediating mine wastewaters. And then in 2014, Gemini became co-recipients of the American Mining Hall of Fame Medal of Merit for transformative contributions to the mining industry. So I thought it was very special that both Gemini got that together. And then in 2018, the president of New Mexico Tech gave me the President's Medal in 2018. And then in 2023, and Mike will know all about this, I received the TMS Extraction and Processing Division's Distinguished Lecturer Award. So I have some of these on my bookshelf, but the TMS Award, Mike, just doesn't show up very well because it's glass.
It's true.
So that I think that those are, I've been well awarded and honored for the things I've done, and I feel very privileged.
Well, you're very deserving, and you have made great contributions, and I'm glad that you've been recognized for some of those. And again, that shows some of the people who will be listening to this that you know um, that people can make these achievements and be recognized for some of them. I mean, some people won't be, but I think it's nice to have that kind of as maybe a goal in mind of working towards being able to be recognized for these kinds of things, and making a contribution is probably the better way of saying that. So you've talked a little bit about the National Academy of Engineering. It's a very prestigious organization, and I think it's interesting that the viewers here should know is that you've been very involved in the organization from a leadership perspective, and have seen how it works, and been able to contribute behind the scenes to a lot of what goes on there. Can you talk to us a little bit about how that membership has influenced you, and maybe some of the things that, the notable contributions that you've made to the NAE?
Yes. The being a member of the National Academy of Engineering has really had a profound influence on my career. First of all, as I mentioned, I'm now an engineer.
Yeah.
I'm officially an engineer, despite my degrees. But as I mentioned, the National Academy of Engineering is part of a larger organization. It's a sister organization to the National Academy of Sciences and the National Academy of Medicine. And collectively, those three academies advise the government through an operating arm on matters related to engineering, medicine, and science. And so a lot of what I've done early on was get involved in the studies that are carried out through the National Academy of Engineering, and a lot of the oversight committees that are also involved in this. So I've been on many of these different studies over the years. Many of them have had something to do with mining industry relative to policies and environment and other aspects of dealing, like workforce. In fact, I just was involved in being the reviewer for a workshop that's been done on the mining workforce. So there's a lot of things that through that I've been involved in. I also got very involved in the NAE itself through various committees. We have a plethora of committees, so I've been involved in a lot of those. And I eventually got reasonably well known within the National Academy of Engineering. Now, mind you, that these are engineers from all different disciplines that are involved in the National Academy of Engineering, but I got fairly well acquainted with many of these people, and so I ended up getting elected because it's an elected position to the council, the NAE Council, which is the governing body for the National Academy of Engineering, and I served in that for 5 years. And then I was asked if I would be willing to run for vice president of the National Academy of Engineering. And I thought, well, they probably need a warm body. So I'll volunteer, to run for the vice president position. Well, lo and behold, I got elected. So I served a 4-year term. And then I was asked if I would run again. This time they didn't run anybody against me, so guess what? I got elected for another 4 years. I would have run again, except that the bylaws don't only allow 2 4-year terms. So I am no longer vice president. I ended my vice presidency in the end of June of 2022. I had actually got involved in a lot of things. Involved in the National Academy of Engineering, and I made some relatively, I think, bold proposals that were allowed to go forward. I think one of the most notable as vice president was you have to understand that all the academies are nonprofit. And so although the studies are funded by the government, when the government wants a study done or work done, they pay for it. But if you want to do anything else, you have to raise money for it. And so as vice president, you chair the development effort. And so I was looking, we have many wealthy people that are NAE members, and there's always a tendency to go back to the same people to raise money. And I thought, we need to broaden our scope here a little bit. So I proposed that, what we ought to do is go out and meet the newly elected members when they get elected. And particularly we elect about 50% of each class comes from the business sector. And they're the least likely to know what the NAE is about, or the academies in general. Academics, as Mike can probably tell you, know a lot about the national academies, but the business community does not. So I took it upon myself to go out and visit the class when we would elect a class, and I would focus largely on the business members. And I would oftentimes meet in person. I would go to the Bay Area for a week and meet with people and get acquainted. And this has done something. I think it's helped. I don't want to over estimate it, but I think it's really helped in terms of the fact that these people now come into the academy as a member, understanding what their role is their role is to advise the government. They also understand that they have to get engaged in various activities, and I think it's also helped on the development aspect in terms of encouraging members to make financial gifts to the National Academy of Engineering. So the president. The current president was quite enthusiastic about this thing I was doing. And so when I had to step down as vice president because I couldn't run again, he brought me on as senior advisor to the NAE president. So I'm still continuing to do that work, and that's what the principal role. The executive officer also decided that I'm a good person to go to when they need some little task done or job. So I'm pretty engaged. Continue to be extremely engaged with the National Academy of Engineering, and I have to confide that my engagement with the National Academy of Engineering has been to the detriment of my professional societies, because I've been so engaged with NAE that I haven't had time to really get as engaged as I should be or like to be with SME and TMS. But I want you to know that I do appreciate what those two professional societies have done and continue to do for me.
Yeah, well, you've been, engaged in those societies, and I think that making the contribution through the NAE is also beneficial to the societies as well. So yeah, thanks for providing some insights on that. So as we kind of get towards wrapping up here for the interview, what advice would you have for today's young engineers in the engineering profession?
I go by the mantra, take risks, regret nothing. You're going to fail. You can't be a winner all the time, but so failure is inevitable in the course of building your career. But the secret is to not let that failure define you. Embrace failure. Learn from your mistakes, and consider it just a step in the journey forward. Certainly, probably the most worst failure I had was my company, but I learned so much from that failure, because that failure actually made me a better consultant, because I can now look at these technologies from a business standpoint, and I can say, in fact, I have had consulting jobs where the company was adamant that they wanted to do bioleaching, and it wasn't for them. It wasn't for them from either a technical standpoint or from a business standpoint. It didn't make sense. There were other technologies that would work better for them. And so I think that was the thing that I learned from that failure was how to look at things, how to look at technology from a business standpoint. The other aspect that I learned from that is that when that company failed, I thought, my colleagues are going to look at me as a failure. And they didn't. They came to me and they said, we admire you for doing what you did. We didn't have the guts to start a company, but you did. And that was a tremendous learning experience for me, is that people respect you even through your failures. So you have to look at that as a young person, as a starting out in your career, because you are going to fail. So again, take risks, regret nothing.
That's good advice. There's no pain, no gain, right?
Right.
They say in another context. So yeah, it's hard to make progress if you're not willing to take some risks and persevere there. So, is there anything else, Corley, that you would like to discuss that we haven't talked about?
Well, I would just like to comment on young people in general. I talk once in a while. I do talk with young people, and many times they don't know about careers in mining. They they think about mining from a legacy standpoint, and the mining industry has so vastly changed. You can be in computer engineering or computer science, and there's a job for you in the mining sector. You can be maybe you want to be a lawyer, but there's jobs in the mining sector for lawyers. There's all kinds of opportunities, and I really, and particularly given the state of the mining industry today, where the mining industry is reducing its carbon footprint. It's trying to work hard to conserve the environmental aspects, the water, and so forth. There are so many opportunities for young people in the mining sector to work. So go to your professional societies, learn about mining, and learn about what you need to do to get educated in a way that can put you into an industry where you meet some of the most exciting and wonderful people in the world.
Yeah. Well, and I might add too that, the mining sector today is critical to like all this clean energy and critical materials and the future. There's a lot of good future because we really need these resources. And in fact, we're going to have to mine more material to get some of these resources that help us go green. So it's kind of interesting.
Very good point,
Yeah.
Mike.
Yeah. Well, so how would you sum up your career in just a few words, Corley?
Dynamic, stimulating, challenging, fulfilling, really cool, and a whole lot of fun.
Well, that's great. I think, throughout this interview, I think that's come out, right? You've had fun, you've had a dynamic career, it's been exciting, and there's a lot of reward that's come to us and comes through these kinds of opportunities. And so you've had a great and fascinating life and career. And thank you for sharing those experiences. It's been a pleasure to talk with you and interview you in this. And thank you so much for your willingness to share.
Well, thank you, Mike. It's been wonderful.